don't know anyone else in the room yet, but my name is Estefana Johnson. I'm in the Phoenix area in Arizona. So Gilbert, it's nice and warm, like 44 degrees right now. Um, so wherever you guys are, we don't get snow. But I've been on this team from the start, so I'm excited to share with you guys a little bit about what CMI is, kind of how it came about, what makes this approach different. And for anyone who knows me, I'm kind of a creative. I worked with kids for 20 years, and so I like to simplify, 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 and then play with it. So I like to really put things into the simplest form possible. So that's why we need my left brain, which is Brian Livesey, who is a researcher. I'm a social worker by training. So I'm going to let Brian introduce himself because he's my.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Steph. Yep. My name is Brian Livesey. I've got my doctorate in clinical psychology, so that's why I get the accusation of researcher at times, though I do love it and I've done plenty of it. A lot of my background includes working with military as a prior service member, but also as a practitioner. And most of that has been done within the VA. A lot of my research and area of interest coming into working with ARISE pertain to stressor trauma related injuries with an emphasis on moral injury and how sort of the current standard treatments for PTSD don't do so well with moral injury. So the complexity around this very human experience, which has been around for, since humans are around, I suppose, how it just hasn't found a an effective approach, or an effective approach hasn't been found for moral injury. Now, I'll put an asterisk on that last statement, effective approach, because there are effective approaches. It's just that they're not so well known or well promulgated. And so that's really kind of where I found myself fitting in with Arise um, as a developer and promulgator of effective therapy for these parts of the human experience, which are real and oftentimes don't get the fair shake from sort of our conventional cognitive behavioral approaches. So you'll learn a lot more about CMI in our discussion today. Please, again, put any questions in chat. We will definitely get to those. But I hope that we were able to give a real good um, upload to y'all about what CMI is and what we're doing with it.
Yeah, thank you. And is everybody able to see the screen? It should say CMI. That looks right. Okay.
Yeah, I'm getting it, Steph.
Yeah. Get the screen share thing. So we, like Kelly said, we'll have opportunities for questions. But if anything comes up, put it in the chat and Julia can step in. So we want to start with just defining what CMI is. And it's something that we've had, it's come a long way from where we started in really describing it, but it really is an experiential psychotherapy where the clinician guides the client on an internal journey, focusing on signals from the body and using sensory motion expansion as a primary method for progress. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means. This approach helps clients access critical memories or significant experiences that shape their perception of reality and influence how they relate to the world, to others, and themselves. And we'll kind of dig into that a little bit more too, as to what that means and what that looks like in practice. But let's start with why we even went on this journey, because trust me, I mean, these last couple years, boy, have been some of the most difficult in my career. I've been in this field for over 20 years. But from the beginning, how we are trained in this field is, of course, to use evidence-based treatment. And for the fidelity, we're kind of trained to do it this way, right? We have to kind of follow the steps. And first being like first generation Mexican American, like in the Latino community, we have a very different concept of what mental health is. I think the DSM would be like one page because it's, my family, it's either you're just that loco or you're fine. There's no like in between. So I think that background definitely impacts how I perceive, mental health and pathologizing certain, I guess, normal human experiences. So in this field, at times, some of the treatments, I've been trained in multiple modalities, they just felt disconnected. It's like we're not really allowed to individualize because we have to respect the fidelity or maintain the fidelity. And I understand the value in that too. But at times it could come at a disservice for the clients that we serve. It could interfere with the therapeutic relationship. Um, in particular, when I was working with kids, there's not a lot of options for evidence-based treatment with kids. There's like play therapy, Santre, TFCBT that I had trained in. But sometimes when you're sticking to a rigid modality, it comes at a price sometimes, depending on the individual you're working with. So it feels like it's a one size fits all. We get stuck in this rigidity and you don't really get the guidance on how to modify and how to individualize. Rather just this is a modality and this is how you need to facilitate it. A lot of our approaches really focus on alleviation, trying to alleviate the symptoms rather than growth and well-being. And this was another piece that I saw limitations in where, okay, this person isn't having flashbacks anymore. They're not having the nightmares, but they're still stuck in the same behavior loops, right? They're still making some of the same choices. They're still ending up in relationships that are abusive or the patterns that we start noticing when individuals have, particularly those with complex trauma. It's almost like how do you reprogram them to reclaim agency rather than get stuck in these patterns. And particularly with the cognitive approaches that I know are really big in our field, working with a population like foster adoptive kids, people who were court ordered for treatment, it really felt like we would teach them one thing and they seemed to get it in residential. And then the moment they left, everything went out the window. And as I started understanding how trauma impacts, the nervous system, how it's stored in the body, all of this other details that we miss with just the cognitive approaches, it became evident that there was something deeper that was driving the behavior. It's not just why would you make such a bad choice? It doesn't seem to come from a place of agency, right? It comes from like almost a reaction. And it is because we're trying to outcompete the adaptive strategies, right? And it's not sustainable. And so there was always that challenge of how do we get to the deeper place, to the root of the issue? And then, of course, when I, started working with memory reconsolidation and really effective strategies, it was beautiful to see outcomes, but it often, I'd have individuals who would come to me to fix things for them. They saw me as the fixer, me as the person that's healing them rather than them doing it themselves. And I saw that as a problem, A, because I'm just a human being like they are, right? But B, we're not trying to create dependence on the clinician. We're trying to help them become their own support, right? That's what agency means, is like you're able to feel a sense of control over your own reality in your life. So these are all kind of the things that were driving us to seek something different. And when we started this project, we looked at all the research. We looked at, there's so many amazing modalities out there that are very effective at treating different, from trauma to anxiety, depression. And so we started by conducting kind of a literature review on some of the most effective based off of like evidence-based modalities that have been published, and started kind of mapping out what is the theory behind this modality? What is their mechanism of action? How does that apply and interact with what we know about what is happening neurobiology at a neurobiological level, right? How memory reconsolidation works, how emotions work in the body, how this impacts overall well-being. And just had charts that we sifted through until we disseminated everything and kind of started looking for similarities. And the goal was really kind of to find an algorithm, right, of how does the brain work? How does the mind heal? And how do we get to these places? So at the base of this is really the concept of memory reconsolidation, which all this is our brain's way of storing information. So when we go through an experience, right, our brain is collecting information about the experience. So it's like okay, who was there? What was happening in the environment? What was I feeling inside? What did it smell like, taste like, the sensory, all of these pieces, including our neurological state, our biological state, right? If I have a broken leg at the time and I'm in pain, or if I have food sickness or something, all these little details are all part of this experience and can shape the way we experience the thing, right? If any of y'all ever had like gone to a concert, maybe you enjoy the music and the environment. But if you have a migraine and you go to the same concert, the same environment, the same music, it's going to be a completely different experience, right? So both our internal state and our perspective, interpretation of things is impacting how we experience these events, these incidents. And this is important because, particularly when it comes to trauma, a big question that I always had was, why is it that we could have like 10 service members go through the same traumatic event, maybe an IUD explosion, but only 4 develop PTSD and the other 6 don't? So we know, these 4 usually have a history of like unresolved childhood experiences, like adversity or trauma. But what I wanted to know is, what do these 6 have that those 4 don't? Or what do those 4 have in addition that those 6 don't, right? And so these are the things that kind of have led to this theory that there are experiences that we go through in life that really shape how we perceive the world and how we interpret future experiences. And when we have situations where it's disrupted our development of certain capacities, then it starts impacting everything else after that. So that's what we call critical memories. So in the training, we break it down to kind of this whole sphere of possibilities of who we can be when we're born. And all of us go through a particular cone in there that shapes, this is meant to look kind of like what do you call it? Like a looking glass, one of those that you look through a tube. And it comes from how I experience life, relationships, attachment, all of these things, and then the adaptive responses that I developed. And now that shapes how I perceive the world. So an example of me being like first generation Mexican American, everything from the food and the language and the culture in my home was very different from what I was exposed to in elementary school, right? When I went to elementary school, it's like going to a completely different world. And so in my little mind, I had to make meaning of that, right? I had to, the experience of being different, the experience of being an outlier, the experience of being not fitting in really impacted how I interacted with others, how I did in terms of even trying with schoolwork. I did horrific in school. I had like F's and D's because I thought I was dumb. No, I was just Mexican. I could only speak Spanish and they're doing this stuff in English, right? But all of this as a child, it came through subconsciously. It wasn't like a decision that I made. And so these experiences, whether they be traumatic or not, impact how we perceive ourselves, the meaning we put behind, and therefore how we interpret interactions. So some situations, some interactions that were not meant to be like ill-intended by others, I might have experiences like traumatic, right? Something that where I felt threatened or my well-being felt threatened. And so I became a fighter. And I had ADHD as a kid. I still do it now, but though all of those things impacted how I interacted, which impacted how I processed subsequent experiences, right? So these are the pieces that we're looking at is, if I am now working at this level of changing this behavior, I could change it temporarily, but I'm going against something that has been wired way before I became an adult. Right. So the CMI approach is different from other conventional approaches in that we're trying to get to the root of where this started. So with a conventional approach, when I first got into this field and I was working in RTC, we did a lot of cognitive approaches. So we taught kids about distortions and thinking errors, and you confront them and you change their thinking. And we call these maladaptive responses. When you're punching people in the face, it's gonna, not okay. It's not acceptable. So we got to find a different way of expressing that anger. So it's about regulating the emotions, about learning how to regulate your nervous system. And more so with the pathologizing, we look at the goal to alleviate the pain or try to uh, come up with other skills to express this a different way, bring awareness to your responses, and then have tools to manage it or change it through repetition, with the idea being that eventually those neural networks are changed and you're able to sustain that a different way of being. But the problem is, it always, when it comes to a critical memory that's driving this, it's like we're constantly trying to outcompete, right? These truths, personal truths that came from earlier experiences, and sometimes they're unconscious, right? I didn't realize how much my own experiences as being first generation affected me in terms of academia. Not until my adult years did I discover it's not that I'm dumb. I can actually understand this stuff. It's just the interpretation I gave it way back when I was 5. Right. And so if I told myself, let me put on the postie, I am smart, I can do this, I am powerful, I can do that and try to outcompete and maybe get a temporary change. But ultimately, when it was a bad day, when I had something that was just beyond my comprehension, that old response came back because it was deeper rooted in an experience, right? An experience will always trump book knowledge. And I tell people, think about, would you want someone, you hire someone for your company. Do you want someone who's read books on doing the thing? Or do you want someone who has 10 years of experience on doing the thing? It's very different, right? That's how our brain responds. So instead of out competing, CMI really aims to update those experiences. And this is why it's an experiential approach. Now, in order to do that, you have to be willing to re-experience. And this is what really, I feel, differentiates CMI from a lot of approaches. Um, I think even just up to a couple years ago, I felt that my role as a clinician was to alleviate pain. Someone comes in my office and they're at a level 10 of distress, and if they leave at a level 2, I did a great, fantastic job. However, the problem is that just alleviating it didn't always translate to a behavioral change or to a change in self-concept. So the individual comes in with all these traumas, and we hit all the big T traumas, little T traumas. They still hate themselves. They still carry shame. They still don't see themselves as worthy. What do you do about that? Right. And so the difference here is, rather than alleviating, right? Because the truth is, we believe that human beings are made to process and digest these experiences, these adversities. We have the capacity to do it. We just may not have been taught, or our culture has kind of dampened that, or our experience has said, no, this is not what you do. For example, as a kid, crying was not acceptable. There was 6 of us, so it's probably a lot of, you know, a lot of noise all the time anyway. But also being Hispanic, is like, why are you crying? There's no reason to cry. And so I was taught emotion suppression rather than emotion expression. And now crying not only becomes a uncomfortable thing to do, but it's unacceptable, and it threatens my relationship with my caretakers. So what do? When I need that emotion to express, I shut it off. And it's a necessary component to digest something related to loss or grief. So instead, those experiences remain undigested, disconnected, not integrated, because I have developed this thing based off of my culture that inhibits that capacity for emotion fluency, right? To be able to get the data, the information, and go through the process that was necessary to digest that experience. And so this is what we call capacities. And there's a lot of modalities that talk about self-capacities. We kind of streamline ours to, the fluency in emotion and sensation and cognition, our agency, like our sense of self, and then our relatability, like our ability to connect. So connectability is what we call it, but it's our ability to connect with ourselves. That includes self-awareness, that includes internal like reflection, our ability to connect with others, right? That means that I have to be able to look at things from a different perception, get perspective on situations rather than just mine, and be connectable. So openness for others to also connect to me. So with CMI, we say you don't explain experience. We really tune into the experience of the individual. We're not putting any type of interpretation on it or judgment on it. Really, the role of the clinician is to hold the space. And in order to do that, we have to be aware of our own experiences, our own perspectives. And I know we talk about this a lot in our field, um, about transference and countertransference, right? But how to actually tap into that requires us to do this, be aware of this, be integrated within ourselves as well. So that's what we teach in our training as well, these skills. The goal of CMI is we use the therapist as a resource for connection, right? It's like we're the cast. The healing is happening in the bone because the body knows how to heal itself. You don't see a doctor putting the cast and then going in and stimulating those cells, right? I guess maybe that could be a thing, but for the most part, it works because the body wants to heal itself, right? And so that's what we believe in the brain, the heart, the soul wants to heal itself. It just needs the safety that at some point maybe it was missing for that natural organic process to occur. We help the individual develop the awareness of signals. So rather than looking at an emotion as something to be like abated or something to be alleviated, we look at it as something to be explored. And that's what we mean by sensation emotion expansion. So whereas in the past, I might have had a client that came in and was upset and feeling like sad or feeling angry, and we're looking at ways of managing or reducing the intensity of that, I'm actually having them lean into it and explore it because the emotion doesn't really last more than like 90 seconds if you're able to experience it on its own terms. The problem is people get overwhelmed with too many of them coming at once, and it's like shoving too much food in your mouth and you can choke on it, right? So it's helping them set some parameters around it so they can digest one at a time, just like you would one bite at a time of your food. And so we call that sensation emotion expansion and allow that sensation or emotion to guide us to the next step. And that's where the internal journey, that's how that is facilitated. We believe that everyone has this core self. You could call it the true self. You could call it the authentic self. You could call it the observer. There's different ways of describing it, but it's the part of you that knows that this piece is the problem, or this is incongruent, or is aware that this cycle that I'm stuck in is not what I want for my life. It's the part that's wanting to take a sense of agency and control over my reality, right? And we go further into that, like helping really identify how do you know they're coming from the core. Now, notice that what's true for my core is going to be different for your core. My passion and what drives me, what's right for me, might be different from what's right for you as far as like what you want to do with your life and how you want to be who you want to be. So this is why it's important that it's an internal process, and we teach the clinician not to disrupt that, how to hold the space for that. And the goal is to integrate these experiences. Because I work primarily with trauma, and I have a lot of colleagues that also, I think, hold this thought is a client comes in and it's this terrible thing that they went through, and our initial response is to help them forget or not have to carry this thing that they went through, right? And we sometimes inadvertently disconnect more of that rather than integrate that, because the truth is they already survived it. They just need to update their mind and their body to know that, so that they can overcome it, right? And that's kind of what we're aiming for. So the difference with my clients now is that rather than trying to get rid of it, they grow bigger than it. They get bigger than the thing they went through. And that is how they describe themselves after, is like that scary house that I kept having nightmares about became this tiny little house in a tree house, and I was bigger than it. I become bigger than that thing. And that's what we mean by integration. It's a part of your story, but it doesn't define you. So you have this expanded sense of who you are, and how you relate to these experiences. So when we go through the training, the foundations course, which is currently like a 2-day online course, really focuses on the clinician and our own experience, like human experience. It's a very humanistic approach. And the reason why that's so crucial is because whether we're conscious of our tendency to, for the, what do we call it again? When our interactions are leading to how we interpret, right? How we interpret what the client is telling us or experience what they're sharing with us. It can lead to, if we're not aware of our own stuff, if we're not aware and we have not learned to kind of uh, respond to our own signals, then we might get that mixed in with like our intuition, and we could either inadvertently derail the process or misattune with the individual. So meaning, if in my experience, I have something that I have not resolved, and I see this a lot with individuals that say, hey, there's a certain population I would never work with. When I started in this field, I worked with juvenile sex offenders. I recognize now, I'm like, I don't know who the heck thought that was a great idea to throw a newbie in with that population, because it is difficult, but I'm very grateful for it now, because the things that they shared, I mean, there was times I like threw up a little bit, in my mouth, and had to learn how to navigate through that and still hold the space and be a safe place for them to share the darkest, most uncomfortable, most shame-ridden experiences, so that we could sift through it and separate that from who they are and what they're capable of being. Right. So these things cannot happen if my wall goes up and they're already carrying shame. They will, misinterpret that wall as, see, I'm not enough. I am disgusting. I am a vile human being. And all of this is happening subconsciously. So it doesn't matter what I put on my face and look at try to seem nice and accepting. My nervous system is going to interact with their nervous system. And there's also information being relayed through that. And it inadvertently impacts that session. And so we really want to help individuals find out how to be in the space of non-judgment rather than hold a facade of non-judgment, if that makes sense. Like really be open and curious. The expected results, probably the biggest shock that kind of really, I wouldn't say broke me, but broke something within me, that was like any hesitation I had about doing things differently, was when a client came in and sat on my couch and told me, I actually welcome flashbacks now. I've never, ever would have imagined somebody saying something like that. I had to be like, wait, what? Can you expand on that? And the truth is, when he first came to see me about 3 years ago, was a lot of flashbacks and nightmares. He was having like super complex trauma, from sexual abuse since age 7, meth addiction, um, every trauma you can expect. I mean, he's been, in home invasions, really, really terrible situations. And uh, so we started with processing the trauma using ART and kind of erasing some of those images, but he still had a lot of self-hatred. And so when we started developing CMI, I started using this approach to integrate rather than desensitize these experiences. And that's when we started seeing a huge shift. He went from hating himself to coming in and saying, I think I'm beginning to like myself, to really appreciating his experience, to now owning his experiences, and now being able to focus on the post-traumatic growth that we talk about. But now he was in the place where he had, call it like almost collected enough of the self, right? Instead of feeling fragmented, you feel more solid, that he no longer needed me to hold that space for him to process these other instances or experiences. he actually felt confident enough in himself to confront that darkness on his own and be able to reclaim what he needed to from it. And that was, in theory, we can say this can happen, but to actually see it manifest was pretty, pretty shattering for me. It was something I never expected. And so another individual that had said, he actually wrote a testimonial, said, I want to help you get this out there. Said I had lost my soul, or it was so far from me I couldn't feel it. Therapy gave me tools, 12 steps gave me hope, and CMI created the path home. So that's what we mean by integration, right? The core of who I am, to be able to hold the space ourselves, to honor these experiences that we've survived and gone through these adversities without the tendency or the urge to withdraw. We become bigger than that. So that's what we mean by an expanded sense of self. There's no shame in that trauma that I endured and I overcame. It is now something that is a part of my story I can own. And what I'm seeing differently too is I've had like 5 clients now that either started or joined a nonprofit that is related to some of the stuff that they experienced because it has now given them purpose. And so it's this whole thing that I'm seeing that I never even realized that we could play that role to that extent, right? And that's what I mean by beyond alleviation, it goes into expansion and well-being and now finding purpose in their life. So the training is really cut into two different portions. And one is the foundations, which part one is it's an online training. And we're looking at the format, just how this works. This is our first year that we had launched. But it seems that clinicians do so far like the ability to have some kind of pre-experience before they go into the clinical application. But this really comes for a lot of the times we don't have the space as humans, clinical humans, right? To really explore how our own experiences impacts our interpretation of situations, of interactions, of all of that. And it really holds the space for the clinician to explore that and to experience CMI themselves, so that by the time they come into clinical applications, they can see it from both the lens of the professional and the lens of the experiential, right, of the recipient. Because one of the things that is beautiful about this is that you don't have to have symptoms for critical memories to be impacting your own way of functioning, and I share my testimony openly all the time, but one of the surprising things that I had, I guess Darla seen me before, that I was a lot heavier, just even 9 months ago. And it was during one of a CMI session that I had discovered I connected to this experience of an assault that I experienced in my 20s. And it turns out, like, I realized my body was holding on to weight, and it was so difficult to take care of myself because my body, my subconscious mind was like, it's not safe to be fit. It's not safe to be thin. And so it was its way of protecting me. And I never had nightmares, flashbacks, any of the traditional or typical, PTSD. I'm pretty functional, been married, happily for 20 years. Like, my kids they got their extremities, all 4 extremities. So I did pretty good with parenting, I think. Like, I'm fairly functional. So I never would have gone to seek out treatment. And I didn't know this was impacting me until I happened to, we're testing out our theories and doing all this stuff. And I got really curious about a response, and lo and behold, this emerged. And all of a sudden, within a couple of weeks of that, something started shifting in me. I'm really curious because I'm like, oh, I'm kind of my own case study, because all of a sudden I desired to go work out again. I started craving better food. I became more attuned to my body, and I never would have realized this piece. It wouldn't, it's just unexpected, but I've seen that happen with at least 3 of my clients also, that all of a sudden things start shifting, with their body and how their body's processing. So it's a very powerful and I think a necessary step. And then we come back for the clinical applications, which is the in-person part of the training, which I think is really where people connect to this. And we did it for 2 days. Some have requested to make it a 3-day training. But we wanted to make it feasible for individuals because, obviously right now we only have a couple of sites that we tend to run the trainings in, one in Gilbert and Tampa. I'm actually going to Michigan next week, but we've done Utah, like, but we have very few hubs. And so to make it accessible, so you don't have to pay, we look at hotel and time away from family in your practice. So that's a 2-day training right now as well. And we do ask that you take those within about 45 days of each other, so the information is still fresh enough. So I always say, look at which in-person training you'd want to take, and then find a CMI Foundations that's close enough, to that, to take it. So anyway, with that, I just kind of ran through that pretty quickly, but I wanted to be able to have enough time, be mindful of your time, and give you space for questions, because I see a couple things in the chat.
Yes. I've been looking through the chat. I saw Heidi kind of touched on some first responder questions that she had. She said, often with first responders, it is not the first traumatic call or the second. It is a buildup and a small thing like a toddler's shoe in the corner that will set off the cascade of trauma.
Yeah.
So I bring that up.
Yeah. I think the moral injury piece, and maybe this is, I'm so glad that term came about, because it, hold on, I don't know why the view is still on you. It won't switch over to me. It decided I talked too much, maybe.
Is it on me?
Yeah, it was. I just switched it over again. But with moral injury, even though that concept usually is limited to, like, first responders or military, it happens with people who went into drug addiction too, right? They do things that goes against who they really are, in their desperate search to alleviate discomfort. They end up violating their own moral code. It happened to me when I was a kid. I mean, my survival mechanism was fighting. I was kind of a fighter as a kid. And so I had a snarky mouth, and so you can, me, passive, sweet, kind me. It was, had some issues when I was younger, and going through the process of, like, even becoming a professional, and then the guilt of maybe some things that sometimes I would say that were not nice or snarky, or, and then feeling like crap, and the shame and the guilt of going against my own moral code. So I think it's such a thing that impacts more than just like first responders. That's just very clear, right? Very evident, because their actions that they have to take are in complete direct conflict. But that whole concept can impact, there's a whole spectrum of ways that it impacts individuals. And I feel, Brian actually did research. That's his research in CMI. He had to step out for another meeting, but that's a good person to connect to. I see he posted some of the stuff on there. But even as a clinician working with kids who were in jail for crimes they committed, or I get a lot of forensic individuals that get, like, either, from probation or parole, or have been in jail or have been in trouble with the law, that get referred to me, and they have complex trauma, and now they have to reconcile choices they made with who they really want to be, and the judgment that we get, from the world and society. And so CMI is fantastic for that. I mean, the individual that I was talking about, there's one that had meth addiction, and he was a doctor. How can you be a physician and be addicted to meth? There was this incongruence there, and it was related to this desperate need to alleviate the discomfort. And so once we started using CMI, what fascinated me is that last year that I worked with him, he said there was some things that happened, including the suicide of his best friend, which normally would have probably catapulted any addict back into, to what do they call it? Relapse. But I remember that moment when he came in, and he was in the midst of grief, and he's like wanting to understand what's happening. He's feeling like he's dying, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's grief. That's normal for humans to experience. What do you do with it? You just feel it. You allow it. You honor it. And when I asked about, do you have any urges? He said, the thought comes, but it's so far away from who I am. It's like I see it float by out there. It's not even close to my sense of self. I thought that's powerful, right? Somebody said, yeah, the re-experience. So when we talk about memory reconsolidation, right, it's really just activating that network or memory trace, and you already have access to changing it just by activating it, which is happening during flashbacks. Unfortunately, when you have the experience of suppression, or what we call constriction, is now you have that memory trace added, extra fear added, extra terror added, because it opened and you shut it and you were scared and you re-experienced it. So it's already happening by activating it, right? So we're not going and saying, hey, replay it. We allow it to happen organically, but the experience itself doesn't always have the full context. So for me, I had some attachment issues. I don't remember being 2 years old. I don't remember being 1 year old, but my heart remembers what the neglect felt like. Right. So I don't need images. I don't need a narrative. The experience alone, in being able to come up and process, because I'm no longer that baby. And we do a lot of like hand on the heart, holding the space for the self, as well as having, I use my colleagues a lot because we're the only ones that know CMI. So I'm like, hey, Brian, I need some space. This thing came up and I want to process it. That's kind of how you start, I think, at the beginning until there's more people trained. But being able to now hold it, allow it to happen, but you're in the space of a person who sees you, who holds that compassion, who holds that safety and attunes, it's changing the way this experience is stored. And it might show up metaphorically, it might show up and you do have images or you do have some narrative connected to it. That the language that the subconscious speak is not as important as the experience it's facilitating and communicating, right? So what has happened with CMI is I had one individual that was processing this feelings of not enough, and I didn't know the history. But when she got to this place and she made the connection, and we call it reconnecting. So a lot of experiential treatment talk about corrective experience. In CMI, we call it a connective experience rather than corrective. Because it's not that it was wrong, right? It just something disconnected from the self. And so we want that to reconnect. Someone said about integration. What that means is who I am includes both the good things and the unpleasant things that I have experienced. All of it is part of my experience as a human being. And I'm able to connect to it, but not see myself through it. So it doesn't define me, but I can own it now, right? This is part of my story. And what that does, it allows me to be aware of. So maybe some of my results was what was it? Avoidant, dismissive attachment style. And now I can be aware of, oh, this feeling of fear that I'm feeling that is causing me to withdraw from my partner or from my kids or whatever it is. I can pause and see, is it about something that's happening here, or is it old unresolved pain from there? And if it is, I can do something about that because I have access to those memory traces. So I can sit for a moment and hold that space and experience that feeling, that sensation. And with the capacity that I have now, my skills as a mother, as an adult, as a therapist, I can also generate this experience of love and compassion. And now those two, the experience here of the pain and lack of connection, right? And the experience of me as an adult are able to integrate and connect together. And it becomes a part of all of me, right? Rather than something for me to detach from because it's uncomfortable and painful. And so with this individual that was going through the process, she kept saying she was at this place where she was teeny tiny. And when she said teeny tiny, it just, for whatever, it stuck in my mind. And so we use that teeny tiny, go back to teeny tiny. After she was done with CMI process, she disclosed that she had been conceived out of rape, right? So she didn't have memory about the rejection she experienced in the womb, but somewhere in her nervous system, this memory trace, right, still elicited that feeling of rejection she could never access cognitively, because this is limited to what we're aware of. we're going to even beneath that, what you may not be aware of. And there's so much about what we do and how we function that we may never recall how we remember. Like, you know how to walk, but you might not remember learning how to walk, but you weren't born walking, right? So you see the manifestation of that experience through your actions, through your ability to walk, run, talk, and eat a burrito at the same time, right? But those skills all started through some experience in life early on, maybe even before your long-term memory was formed. And so that's what with CMI, that's why we focus in on experience. Because if you're looking for narrative, it's going to limit you to what things you're conscious of, right? If you're looking for images, it's going to limit you to things that, again, your brain comes up with. Sometimes it's a metaphor, sometimes it's just a sensation, emotion expansion. Hopefully that makes sense for you guys. Now, the other piece that we're doing different that probably than what the traditional or typical way I was taught, and I've kind of always leaned towards this, is really trusting that the brain is going to guide us in what needs to be processed versus us being the expert. So what that means, I would never start with saying, hey, let's look for your big T traumas or little T traumas and start with the first or the worst or anything like that. Completely opposite. We start with where you are, where you're aware of the signal, because this thing I'm doing, I don't like it. Or this response that I'm having is extra. It doesn't match the situation. And I'm recognizing that it's not congruent. Or this loop that I'm stuck in, I keep finding myself in the same type of relationships. Or this, these type of experiences where I lack confidence or whatever. It doesn't matter, the whole gambit. We take the signal that's coming from the body and it will guide us to that critical experience. And through the process of reconnecting or integrating, by the end of the session, they're able to come back and look at that thing and it looks different. They experience it differently, right? It's no longer a thing to be avoided. In fact, sometimes they get curious and want to move more towards it and learn more from it. Hopefully that made a little bit of sense.
Yeah.
From the integration portion.
Vincent asked, are there any demos about CMI?
So we have in training, we definitely got some recorded sessions that you watch during training. But we don't have because they're authentic sessions, like we don't just put them out in public. I know that recently we had a couple individuals who had gone through the process that were willing to share their testimony. So I think one of them, the Arise, if any of you follow Arise Alliance on social media, they just posted this guy's testimony about his experience with CMI. But we're looking at, we've been a really small team, and on this big mission has been a lot of work. That part of our to-do list includes writing the case studies. In fact, that's what kind of me and Brian are focusing on this week. But hopefully we'll have some more of that data. We do have a university that we've partnered up with that we're looking at conducting some studies with CMI, with individuals with HIV, because it's one of the populations I happen to have some referrals to that did fantastic with CMI. A CMI session can go as quickly as like 10 minutes. I mean, it really depends on the individual. When we get into clinical applications, then we talk about maybe individuals who haven't really bought into the sensation emotion expansion, have a lot of constriction. It might look different than like a typical journey right through. I call it like dipping down and coming back out. But sometimes I'll have individuals that come in that I see, and I'm doing their intake. It's our first session together, and they're very aware. They have enough awareness. They've done some work already, so they're not hesitant to explore discomfort, and they have enough introspective awareness as well that they're willing to do this. And I just guide them through the process. And I mean, I had one dude that went through it in 4 minutes, and came out, and it was that he was worried about his response at his son's game. And he's like, well, I have practice tonight. What am I supposed to do? And I just had some time at the end of the session. I said, we could try this really quick. And it turned out it connected to his own experiences of not being protected as a 10-year-old. Once he integrated that, he looked back at the practice that night and was like, I don't know what I'm worried. Like, the coach is my best friend. He always protects my son. It just shifted, you know? And so I could tell you, I use this in with some, maybe I would say like 70% of my clients can go through a CMI within 20, 30 minutes. It's rare that it lasts longer than that. Maybe someone who would need more time. I have had a couple individuals that just run with it. They're in there and they start connecting, making one connection. And now I'm like sitting outside waiting on them to do all the other connections because they decide, oh, this thing's connected to this thing, this thing, this thing. And all of it's happening internal. So as long as I'm checking in, making sure they're still safe, they could do a lot of work within one session. I had one lady that came in and I actually recorded that one session. She had a whole list of stuff. She was done. We didn't have to go back and do another session. By the end of that 50 minutes, I think I spent with her, she's like, no, it was all connected. But it was a moment where she was internal for like 9 minutes. I timed it later when I was looking at the video. I told her, man, I sat there and felt like I'm gonna do my taxes or something because there was nothing else for me to do other than hold, the space for them. But it really is, it's a process that you could do within a session. And then afterwards, sometimes they want to share what happened. They want to share the insights. The most beautiful thing is when they leave, oftentimes in between, they continue exploring. They continue moving towards that discomfort and they discover what they're capable of. Because how many of us are afraid of feeling afraid, right? Of feeling fear or afraid of feeling the pain or the sadness or whatever it is. And what happens if we go through it? We always talk about you have to feel it to heal it. But what does that mean and what does that look like where we're constantly trying to alleviate? Right? We kind of rob them of that experience. And so this is where CMI is, there's other experiential therapies that move in that direction, but we're very intentional with that as the mechanism.
Thanks, Steph.
Yeah.
We have about 5 more minutes left, so I do want to get to this last question, and then we can end with any follow-up questions you guys may have. This one says, I'm in a heavily LDS Mormon community where there's a lot of religious baggage that are associated with future next world life based upon performance here. They can become traumatized at their lack of perfection and future destiny. My question is, how could this address some of the deeply held beliefs that may be associated with their suicidality or trauma? I also work in addiction and how that could be impacted here.
Yeah, so I work in Gilbert, Arizona, which is heavily LDS as well. So I get a lot of clients that have gone through either are leaving the church or want or really believe in this and don't know how to reconcile like discrepancies in what matches and what doesn't. Just to be for full disclosure or clarity, my background, I raised in a cult and not LDS at all. I'm not calling LDS a cult. The church I was raised in and with my parents, aside from my childhood trauma, like poverty and all these things, women were not supposed to wear pants. Like I had to wear long dresses, couldn't cut my hair, couldn't wear makeup, was not supposed to go to school, was not supposed to read anything that was not from the church. So we're prohibited from having any like worldly materials, couldn't have a TV, couldn't have, any music other than what was church music. And trust me, like they sucked at singing, like you did not want to listen to those tapes. But that was my experience as a child. And I think that's part of what has impacted my passion is because I know how hard it was to break away from that because deep inside, I'm like, I know you tell me I'm special and I'm a child of God and everybody else is going to burn in hell for eternity. And it's a constant threat for me. If I remember getting one of the pastors from the pulpit said I was sinning because my skirt had a slit in the back that was this long at 15 years old, right? And so I was causing men to sin because I had a slit in the back of my skirt that was below my knees. And I'm like, oh, so now I'm condemned too. And it just was like constant stress. So talk about perfectionism. But deep, deep inside, there was something that said, this is not for you. This is not. Because I would see my neighbor and I loved them. And I said, why would they get punished when they're such a good person? Right? Or things that I would see that I thought, this is wrong. I know that it's what's right in what you're teaching me, but it feels wrong. And that's what I mean by the core. There's something within you that knows there's an incongruence. And so I teach individuals to connect to that knowing more. That's what we're doing with CMI by exploring these things, moving towards the discomfort. And all of a sudden they start gaining clarity. So we're not guiding them through how to reconcile that. We're guiding them through the experience of that so that they get clarity on reconciling those things. And that's kind of my process through even CMI, these connections that I made. And I realized, what looked like a rebellion was really a fight for my own agency, right? And now you got to separate like religion from spirituality, because you can have somebody who's highly spiritual in a particular religion or belief, and someone who's not spiritual at all and very rigid in the religion and belief. We could see that in every religion, every spirituality. I mean, I know yogis that I'm like, I know you do savasana every day and your 30 minutes of meditation, but you're kind of a jerk, like it's the same thing. Anything like, these practices, we got to learn how to separate the self, not the practice itself. This could be very beneficial. My parents, my father until his deathbed was still of that religion. My mother is still of that religion, and I care for her now, but she's in my home and follows my rules while she's here. So this process definitely, we don't have to have the answer, but we help them. That's what I mean by the core self. Something within them is sending the signal to the point that they get so desperate that they think the only way is out of this life. But no, that signal, teaching them to tune into that signal, that's what's going to guide them as to what is the truth for them and what they need to do and how they need to proceed. Hopefully that makes sense for you, whoever asked that question. And that takes so much pressure off of me, And like I said, this was the piece I had not integrated, like my own religious trauma, because I had, on top of that, my mom was adopted, and her bio mom was a prostitute. So she had a lot of like neurological things that I think happened to her. So she was very, very abusive throughout my childhood. And so that was very common trauma, right? Like that I was very aware of how that impacted me, but I didn't realize how much like the religious stuff had also impacted me until I started doing work with CMI and I got to these less loud things, that were driving my behavior, not the so obvious ones. Yes, we can use other treatment modalities. Like this is the beauty. CMI is not, I always looked at, there's so much wonderful approaches out there that are amazing and fantastic. But then you're told you have to do it only this way. And I'm like, but I like this here and that. And maybe it's like me being Mexican because we put like 2,000 ingredients in every dish that we make. We're like, we're going to add this or we're going to add that. And I think any well-seasoned therapist is going to be integrative that way, that they're going to recognize that you come to a place and you need to sprinkle a little bit of that, right? Or you need to bring in a little bit of somatic experiencing or a little bit of the eye movements or a little bit bilateral or whatever it is. CMI is really the bone of all it is like, this is how a human integrates their experience. And this is how the meaning comes up. And now that you know that pattern and you know how to go through it, bring in the tools that you have and use them as necessary. It's beautiful. And we actually have an individual that just joined our team that specializes in IFS because he's like, this is what I need. We're going to put this together. So we're still in the process of bringing in more tools, but absolutely, we encourage you to fit what you know, to bring in what you know. This just helps you know how to integrate it more intentionally. So unlocking your emotional brain. Yeah, the information for training